those of you who have read the books or seen the films might remember that Harry Potter has an unusual nickname. Because he miraculously survived the freak storm that killed his parents, he is known as the boy who lived. And although he doesn't realize that he actually has this nickname until he goes to Hogwarts, it is a name that shapes how others perceive him and how he understands his own life and destiny. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, as in each story he goes through some life-threatening situation from which he survives. Do you have a nickname that has been given to you? Have you spent time and effort trying to live into a name or live down a name? In another fictional example, one of the characters in the film Pitch Perfect introduces herself as Fat Amy. When she's questioned by the skinny girls that she says this to, she replies that she calls herself Fat Amy so skinny girls like you don't do it behind my back. In the name, by proudly claiming her derogatory name, she helps deflect the hurt that often comes with such hard names. But in the film, it's a funny moment. But outside the film, it's a reminder of the hurt we cause people by the names that we give them, particularly the names that we give to outsiders. Names are powerful. And names that are given by others to describe something about us can be hard to shake. Whether they're accurate or not, whether we like them or not, whether they flatter us or not. When a name reflects one reality about us, whether it is true or not, it tends to reduce all of who we are to that one dimension. I've been thinking about names this week as I've been pondering this week's text from the Gospel according to Mark and the way it names or doesn't name the characters in this two-part story. Our story from Mark happens as Jesus' ministry is really getting into full swing. He's been teaching in parables throughout Galilee and has started to become widely known for healing the sick and other deeds of great power. Just before this section of chapter 5, as Helen mentioned, he has stilled a storm on the Sea of Galilee and exorcised a legion of demons from an outcast man living among the tombs. And even though he tells the people he healed not to tell anyone what happened to them, the word is getting around that he has great healing power, and 2 people come to him hoping for his help. Now, throughout most of the history of biblical scholarship, the Gospel according to Mark has been kind of to be irreverent, the Rodney Dangerfield of Gospels. Kind of the short little gospel that doesn't get no respect. It's brief and skinny without a lot of meat on its bones. It's written in rather inelegant, clunky Greek. And it led most scholars to believe that its author really wasn't very well educated. Early biblical scholars, really early, like St. Augustine, thought that because Mark was so pared down and Matthew was so much more robust, that Matthew was the first gospel and Mark was just a mere copy. And it wasn't until recently, really in the 20th century, that most scholars realized that Mark is probably the earliest gospel, the first one written down. And Mark has taken its proper place now in having its own year in the Revised Common Lectionary Cycle of Biblical Readings. And despite its clunky, uneducated Greek, Mark does create some fantastic literary devices. And today's story is an example of one of them. Helen kind of mentioned that this is a story within a story, and there's an actual word for that. Intercalation. Intercalation. No, it's also a chemistry term, so you scientists out there might know that intercalation is to insert something in between layers. Okay, so insert something in between layers. And in a literary sense, this means that the author begins one story and then starts another story before finishing the first, making sort of a literary sandwich. At least 5 times in the Gospel, Mark uses this intercalary device. Okay, so there now you have the noun and the adjective. We're not exactly sure why he uses it, but it does make us pay attention to these sandwich stories in a way that we might not otherwise. Just like an actual sandwich, the sandwich stories need to be seen together. When you've got a really good sandwich, you don't want to just eat the bread and not the innards. And neither do you just want to eat the inside and ignore the bread. You want to have the whole thing together. And so even though it's tempting to study only one story and not the other, it's really important to see these stories together, which seems to be what Mark intended by putting them together the way he did. So when we see these two stories together, we notice the contrasts between the characters. Jairus is the leader of a synagogue, which meant that he was a person of wealth and privilege in his community, someone who could afford to provide for or maintain the building in which the synagogue was. And by contrast, the woman who desperately reaches out to touch the hem of Jesus' robe is quite likely an outcast. She has no name, and she's only described as one who has been bleeding for 12 years. She has spent all her money on doctors and is now destitute and desperate for healing. Her physical ailment is only part of the problem. Her bleeding would have made her ritually impure by Jewish custom. She wouldn't have been able to take part in religious rituals or enter the temple. Friends and family would not have been able to touch her or touch anything that she had touched. In fact, she was violating taboos by coming out into the crowd where others would be able to touch her, and she certainly violated the rules by reaching out to touch the clothing of Jesus. It's kind of hard to see, but I love this picture by James Tussaud. You really get the sense of the crowd and the woman reaching out to touch Jesus. The woman couldn't be any more different from Jairus or his daughter, a beloved child of a wealthy community leader. She was one of the most marginalized sorts of people in her community. I'm reminded of the early days of the AIDS epidemic and the story of a man whose parents asked him to live in the garage, and they put his food out on the back porch, and he was only allowed to go get it when they had gone back into the house. Such is the way we marginalize those we believe are unclean. But Jesus doesn't marginalize her or punish her for reaching out. Instead, he acknowledges her healing. He even renames her. He calls her daughter, equating her with the beloved daughter of Jairus, pulling her back into the community and affirming her identity as a child of God. He sets her free from the restrictions of her illness and marginalization, and he sets her on a path of new, hopeful future. Jesus touches the untouchables, and instead of making him unclean, which is what his culture would assume would happen, he instead brings healing. By doing this, Jesus challenges the assumptions of his culture about who is clean and who is unclean, raising doubts about whether such categories are even appropriate. He affirms that even those considered outcasts in society are indeed part of the family of God. Notice, though, that just because he stops to heal the woman, that Jairus and his daughter don't miss out on the healing. In our society, we tend to think that one person's gain means another person's loss. We tend to think that if the last shall be first, it means those who were first will be excluded. But that isn't so in God's kingdom. The reign of God means that all will be fed, all will be healed, and all shall have enough. The events of the past couple of weeks, from the tragedy of Charleston to the triumph of marriage equality have reminded me of the power of names. Think of the way we name and label those who are different from us, whether by skin color or ethnicity or gender orientation or belief. Think of the names we hang on and hurl at others to objectify and dehumanize them. We humans are a tribal bunch, and we tend to gather with those who appear to be like us. We marginalize those who are different by naming their difference, stripping them of their individuality, and lumping them together as other, drawing a border between the insiders and the outsiders. But Jesus does the exact opposite. Jesus is constantly crossing borders, whether they're geographic or social, to see people for who they are and draw them into relationship. That's why the woman who interrupts Jesus' preaching and healing tour is no longer just woman or the one who'd been bleeding for 12 years. She is now daughter, one restored to family and community and health and life. And this, of course, is what we are called to do as well. To see people for who they really are, unique persons, each created in the image of God, and each worthy of our care and attention and love and respect. Christ calls us to leave the comfortable and familiar behind in order to reach out to others as brothers and sisters, all children of God. But let's be honest, here just saying so isn't enough. We know this. We know that what happened in Charleston is horribly wrong. We know that the marginalization of AIDS patients was wrong. We know the dehumanization of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters is wrong. We know that the discrimination on the basis of ethnicity or religion or economic status or gender orientation that happens across the country every single day is also tragically and terribly wrong. We know being told it one more time will not make much difference. What might make a difference, though, is being known and named ourselves. What might help is recognizing that we too are often labeled, reduced to one attribute or incident that hardly captures our identity, and yet has named and shaped our behavior and our future in ways that are unhealthy and unhelpful. Perhaps our task this week is to call to mind those names we have been given, perhaps only by ourselves, that seem to chase us through the day and haunt us at night. To name those illnesses or failures or missteps or regrets that somehow have come to name and define us. And then to notice that Christ sees us differently. Christ names us differently. We are daughter. We are son. We are person of great faith. We are faithful and healed. We are beloved of God. In Christ, you see, we are given a new name. With our baptism, we are named as children of God and promised that no matter what happens, no matter where we are on life's journey, no matter what we may do or have done to us, God always, always sees a unique and beloved individual worthy of love, honor, and respect. And each week when we come to this sacred place, in the bosom of this sacred community, we come to be reminded of our new name, to be reminded of our true identity, given by God in absolute and unconditional love. We come to be reminded because so much in the world makes us forget. So we come here each week to be healed, to be transformed, and to be renamed once again. And when we have remembered our new name and received again our new identity, perhaps then we can go out and resist the urge to use destructive names to define and label others. Perhaps then we can reach out in love to call those around us, and especially those whom society has overlooked, to call them brothers and sisters, daughters and sons, mothers and fathers, all children of God. The boy who lived, the girl who spat, the woman who bled, the man who failed, the girl who dropped out of high school, the kid that got hooked on drugs, the family with no home, the alien without documentation. These are not the names that God has in store for us. Today, name yourself anew. Call yourself beloved child of God. Know that you are healed and transformed and set free to walk into a new and hopeful future.